Welcome to Apocalypse. Danny, we're holding the helicopter. I want to give Stephen a bit more time to think things through.
Just can't wait to get back and see my family and then just start over, I guess.
Second chance.
Second chance, yeah. You realise you're just wasting the life you got. Can't believe it. But that's in the past, isn't it?
What?
It's in the past.
It is.
Okay, Darren, do we go on the klaxon?
Let's go, klaxon.
What's that?
Holy shit! What do we do? What do we do? Helicopter?
Rescue helicopter.
They're just there, they're just there. It's the helicopter.
Where?
I can hear it, I can hear it, I can hear it, I can hear it, I can hear it.
All right. Well.
What do we do?
What do we do?
They're not in, hold on.
Okay. Slowly.
Come in.
Oh my God.
Slowly.
Oh my.
Okay, helicopter, ignore the SOS. You are landing outside the compound and away from the infected. That is outside the compound, thank you.
This is great! Hey! How are we gonna get to that? How are we gonna get to that? Jesus Christ!
Okay, Danny, let's see if Stephen is brave enough to distract them while you two run through.
If one of us can distract them there, we can run past them, and then whoever's left has to, like, run round past them. I'll get Leona there. Go.
Okay, Danny, run to the helicopter. Leona, you're too scared, so you run and hide in that gatehouse. Leona, he can't see you. You need to get back to the base. Go back to the base, Leona.
Why don't you run?
I couldn't, there were too many of them. I'm sorry.
Right. Can you not run? Can you not go for it? Oh, what can we do?
Can't we just wait until they've gone?
There's no time, the helicopter's gonna go.
Get the helicopter and then bring the helicopter back into the compound, yes? And they can then, yeah. So, Leona, tell Stephen to get into the helicopter and bring it back into the compound to pick you up. You are too scared to run through the infected.
I can't leave, I'm too scared. But you can. You can run and get them
I'm
to
not
land
leaving
here.
you.
If I stay here, I'll lock myself in, I'll be safe. But please, you can. If you just go to the chopper, you can get them to land here. I don't want to run through them. I can't do it. Please.
Stay here, right, as long as it's safe. I'll try and come back.
Okay.
I'm not leaving Leona! What do you mean?
Leona's still inside!
Hang on, what?
Leona's still inside! She wouldn't go with you, you fucking left her!
What? I didn't mean, I lost her, man, I lost her! Alright, so what do we do?
Try and lure them out!
I'm not that guy, alright? I'm not that guy who goes back. I can't do it, alright? You are, alright? I know that, okay? I'm selfish. I always have been. I always will be. I just don't have a heart. And you do. I'm never gonna change, mate. Look at me. Go and save her.
I'm sorry, mate, there are too many infected. If you go back, you're on your own.
Take care of him, and you're going to go and see your mum, and you're going to change your life. You're going to change your life, okay? You get on the helicopter, do you hear me?
Yeah. You have 2 mirrors and your bedclothes are white where you sleep on your side like this, away from the light, because you like to turn in the middle of the night when you're sleeping. You look very peaceful when you sleep.